September 1221. In a narrow mountain valley north of Kabul, something impossible is about to happen. A Mongol army, the most feared military force on the planet, is about to be destroyed. Not just defeated, destroyed. Sources suggest over half their warriors will die in this valley, killed by a desperate coalition of refugees, mountain tribesmen, and the last remnants of a shattered empire. For 2 years, the Mongols under Genghis Khan have been tearing through Central Asia like a force of nature. They've obliterated cities that had stood for 1,000 years. They've massacred populations so thoroughly that those cities still haven't recovered today, 8 centuries later. Every army that faced them has been annihilated. Every prince who resisted has fled or died. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, has been erased from existence in less than 2 years. And now, in this Afghan valley called Parwan, a young prince named Jalal al-Din, probably around 21 or 22 years old, is about to hand the Mongols their only significant defeat in the entire Western campaign. He's outnumbered, out-equipped, leading a fractious alliance of troops who barely trust each other, fighting the most disciplined army the medieval world has ever seen. And he's going to win. By the end of this video, you'll understand how terrain and tactics overcame the Mongol military machine, why this victory sparked rebellions across an entire conquered empire, and how the battle's aftermath was even more tragic than the triumph itself. This is the Battle of Parwan, where for 2 days in September 1221, the Mongol tide was turned back, and one man proved that Genghis Khan's armies could bleed. To understand Parwan, you need to understand the catastrophe that preceded it. The Khwarezmian Empire wasn't some minor kingdom. At its height under Shah Muhammad II, it stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, encompassing modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan. It controlled the Silk Road cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, some of the wealthiest and most cultured cities on earth. This was a sophisticated, powerful empire with hundreds of thousands of troops and fortifications that had withstood sieges for centuries, and Genghis Khan destroyed it in 2 years. The war started over what seemed like a minor diplomatic incident. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a merchant caravan to establish trade relations with the Khwarezmian Empire. He was genuinely interested in commerce, in connecting the Mongol domains with the wealthy Islamic world. The caravan reached Otrar, a border city, where the governor, a man named Inalchuk, had the entire caravan arrested on suspicion of spying. Then he had them all executed and seized their goods. Genghis Khan sent 3 ambassadors to Muhammad II, demanding justice and the extradition of Inalchuk. The Shah, either through arrogance or catastrophically poor judgment, had 1 ambassador beheaded and the other 2 sent back with their beards burned off, the ultimate insult in both Mongol and Muslim culture. That was the moment Muhammad II signed his empire's death warrant. In late 1219, Genghis Khan crossed into Khwarezmian territory with an army estimated between 90,000 and 200,000 men. Muhammad II had perhaps 400,000 troops, but he made a fatal strategic error. Instead of concentrating his forces for a decisive battle, he scattered them across his vast empire, garrisoning individual cities. He was thinking defensively, trying to protect everything, which meant he protected nothing effectively. The Mongols moved with a speed that shocked their enemies. While Muhammad expected them to come through the obvious mountain pass, the Dzungarian Gate, Genghis, instead, did the impossible. He led his main force across the supposedly impassable Kizilkum Desert in winter and appeared before Bukhara in February 1220, hundreds of miles from where the Khwarezmians expected him. Bukhara fell in days. The Mongols herded the population into the fields outside the city, conscripted the able-bodied men to serve as human shields in the next siege, and systematically looted everything of value. Then they burned it. Ancient libraries, priceless manuscripts, architectural wonders, all reduced to ash. Samarkand, one of the most beautiful cities in the Islamic world, held out for 5 days before surrendering. The Mongols killed perhaps 100,000 people there, not in battle, just methodical execution. They selected craftsmen and skilled workers to be sent back to Mongolia as slaves. Everyone else was killed or left to die. But those weren't even the worst massacres. That distinction belongs to the cities of Khorasan. Genghis Khan sent his youngest son, Tolui, to subdue the region with about 7,000 men. Tolui carried out his father's orders with what one historian called a thoroughness from which that region has never recovered. Merv, a city that may have had a population of several 100,000, was promised mercy if it surrendered. It did. Then the Mongols spent days systematically executing everyone. Contemporary sources claimed over 1 million dead, which is certainly exaggerated, but even conservative modern estimates suggest tens of thousands were killed. Nishapur suffered an even worse fate because of a personal grudge. Genghis Khan's son-in-law, Tokuchar, was killed during an earlier siege of the city. When Nishapur finally fell, Tokuchaw's widow was given the honor of overseeing the massacre. Medieval sources claim that even cats and dogs were killed, that the city was literally left without a living thing inside its walls. The severed heads of the dead were arranged in pyramids outside the city gates as a warning. Herat initially surrendered and was spared. When it later rebelled, the Mongols returned and spent a week killing everyone they could find. The death toll was so extreme that chroniclers found it difficult to quantify. This was the context in which Jalal al-Din came to power. His father, Muhammad II, had fled west with his most loyal troops, pursued by Mongol generals Subutai and Jebi. Muhammad made it to a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he died in December 1220, either of pneumonia or, as some sources suggest, from the shock and despair of watching his empire collapse around him. Muhammad's death left his eldest son, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, as the last hope of the Khwarezmian dynasty. But what kind of hope could he really represent? The empire was gone. The great cities were ruins or under Mongol occupation. The army was scattered or destroyed, and Jalal al-Din was young, probably in his early 20s, the son of a concubine rather than the Shah's primary wife, which meant he faced challenges to his legitimacy, even from his own family. Most men would have fled. Most men would have accepted that the game was over. Jalal al-Din did something different. He gathered what remained of his father's forces and headed east, into the mountains of Afghanistan, to continue the fight. Jalal al-Din Mingburnu wasn't supposed to be Shah. He was the eldest son, yes, but in the complex politics of the Khwarezmian court, being born to a concubine rather than the Shah's principal wife was a significant disadvantage. His younger half-brother had been favored by their powerful mother, Turkan Khatun, who wielded enormous influence. But when the Mongol invasion shattered the empire, questions of court precedence became irrelevant. Jalal al-Din had something his rivals lacked. He could actually fight. Contemporary sources describe him as brave and energetic, possessing real military talent. The Persian historian Juzjani wrote that he was endowed with great heroism, valor, and high talents. But more than that, he had something the Mongols hadn't encountered much in their western campaign: genuine defiance. Where other rulers fled or surrendered, where cities opened their gates in terror, Jalal al-Din looked at the unstoppable Mongol war machine and decided to resist. After his father's death, Jalal al-Din made his way to Ghazni in eastern Afghanistan. This was dangerous territory for him. The region was nominally part of his father's empire, but local power structures were complex, and many lords were more interested in protecting their own domains than following a young prince with no army. Jalal al-Din needed to build a coalition from scratch. What happened next is remarkable. Throughout the summer of 1221, as word spread that a Khwarezmian prince was gathering forces in Ghazni to resist the Mongols, people came. They came from across Afghanistan, thousands of them. Afghan mountain tribes, Turkmen warriors, remnants of the Khwarezmian army, local lords who saw Jalal al-Din as their best chance against the invaders. This wasn't a professional army in the traditional sense. It was a coalition of desperation. Jalal al-Din's maternal uncle, Amin Malik, arrived with 10,000 men. Kurdish commanders brought their followers. Afghan chiefs descended from the mountains with their tribal warriors. By the time Jalal al-Din was ready to move, he commanded perhaps 60,000 troops. These numbers are significant because they weren't just soldiers following orders. Every man in that army had heard what the Mongols did to cities that resisted. They knew about Merv, about Nishapur, about the pyramids of skulls. They knew that if they lost, there would be no mercy, no ransoms, no possibility of surrender. They were fighting because their homes had been destroyed or would be destroyed, because their families had been killed or would be killed, because resistance was the only option left that preserved any shred of dignity. Jalal al-Din's first test came at a place called Waliyan, also spelled Valian in various sources. The Mongols were besieging the town with two separate forces under commanders named Tekajik and Molger. Jalal al-Din attacked both forces and defeated them, lifting the siege and inflicting about 1,000 Mongol casualties. This was huge, not because 1,000 dead Mongols changed the strategic situation. They barely mattered in the grand scheme of the invasion, but because it proved the Mongols could be beaten in the field. Cities had fallen through siege, but in open battle on terrain of his choosing, Jalal al-Din had won. After Waliyan, Jalal al-Din withdrew to Parwan, about 50 miles north of Kabul, to regroup and prepare for the main Mongol response he knew was coming. The choice of location wasn't accidental. Parwan sat in a narrow valley in the Hindu Kush mountains, the kind of terrain where cavalry couldn't maneuver effectively, where numbers and mobility meant less than defensive position and determination. Medieval sources describe Jalal al-Din spending days preparing the battlefield. He studied the approaches, positioned his forces to control the high ground, and waited. He knew Genghis Khan wouldn't ignore the defeat at Waliyan. He knew a Mongol army was coming. What he didn't know was whether his fractious coalition would hold together when they saw the enemy approaching. According to the account of Ibn al-Athir, a contemporary Arab historian, Jalal al-Din even sent a defiant message to Genghis Khan himself, something like, "In which locality do you want the battle to be so that we may make our way to it?" Whether this exchange actually happened or was a later embellishment by chroniclers trying to emphasize Jalal al-Din's courage isn't certain, but it captures something important about how he approached the coming fight. He wasn't trying to hide, he wasn't trying to escape. He was ready to face the Khan's forces, and those forces were coming. To understand why Parwan was such a shock, you need to understand what the Mongol army actually was. This wasn't just a large force of skilled horsemen. The Mongol military under Genghis Khan was the most sophisticated, disciplined, and effective fighting force the medieval world had ever seen. The Mongols organized their army in a decimal system. Units of 10 soldiers formed an Arban led by an Arban commander. 10 Arbans formed a Yaghun of 100 men. 10 Yaghuns formed a Minghan of 1,000 men, and 10 Minghans formed a Tumen of 10,000 men. This system allowed for extraordinary flexibility. A Tumen could operate independently for months, covering hundreds of miles, yet remain coordinated with the main army through an efficient messenger system. Every Mongol warrior was raised from childhood to ride and shoot. They could accurately fire arrows at full gallop, reload while riding, turn in the saddle to shoot backwards during a retreat. They carried multiple bows, dozens of arrows, and could sustain a rate of fire that no infantry force could match. Their composite bows, made from horn, wood, and sinew, had effective ranges of 200 to 300 yards, far superior to most contemporary weapons. But it wasn't just individual skill. Mongol tactics were devastatingly effective. They used feigned retreats to draw enemy forces out of position, then surrounded and destroyed them. They employed scouts who ranged far ahead of the main army, providing real-time intelligence. They adapted to different terrains and enemies, learning siege warfare from Chinese engineers, incorporating foreign troops and tactics when useful. Most importantly, the Mongols were utterly disciplined. When a Mongol commander ordered a retreat, his troops retreated immediately without panic, ready to turn and fight the moment the order came. When ordered to advance, they advanced in coordinated waves. This level of discipline, combined with their mobility and firepower, made them almost unbeatable in open terrain. That's why Genghis Khan's decision to send Shigi Kutuku to deal with Jalal al-Din is so interesting. Shigi Kutuku wasn't a typical frontline Mongol general. He was Genghis Khan's adopted son, found as a foundling during a raid on a Tatar camp when he was very young. The boy was wearing a gold nose ring and silk clothes, clearly from a noble family. Genghis Khan's wife, Borte, adopted him and raised him alongside the Khan's own sons. Shigi Kutuk's primary role in the empire was as chief judge, the Yek Yaguchi, responsible for codifying and enforcing Mongol law. He was literate, one of the first Mongols to learn to read and write, and had served as a legal administrator for years. While he had military experience and had participated in campaigns, his reputation was built more on administration and law than as a seasoned combat commander like Subutai or Jebi. The sources suggest Genghis may have underestimated the threat. Jalal al-Din had won at Walian, yes, but that was against secondary forces. The Khan was occupied with other matters, finishing the subjugation of northern Afghanistan and dealing with rebellions in previously conquered territory. He gave Shigi Kutuku a force estimated between 30,000 and 50,000 men. Contemporary sources differ on the exact number, and sent him to hunt down the Khwarezmian prince. It was more than enough, or should have been. Even 30,000 Mongol cavalry should have been able to defeat Jalal al-Din's larger, but less experienced and poorly equipped force. On open ground, with room to maneuver, it wouldn't have even been close. But Jalal al-Din wasn't going to fight on open ground. The march from the Mongol positions to Parwan took Shigi Kutuk's forces through increasingly difficult terrain. The Hindu Kush mountains are serious obstacles, with narrow passes, high elevations, and limited supplies. This was nothing like the steppes of Mongolia, or even the plains around Samarkand and Bukhara. Here, the Mongols' usual advantages, mobility, room to maneuver, the ability to surround and overwhelm their enemies, were severely limited. Shigi Kutuku knew Jalal al-Din was at Parwan. His scouts had located the Khwarezmian camp. What he apparently didn't fully appreciate was how completely the terrain favored the defenders. Or perhaps he did appreciate it, but felt confident that Mongol discipline and skill would overcome the disadvantage. After all, Mongol armies had overcome worse obstacles before. On a September day in 1231, the Mongol army entered the Parwan Valley and saw Jalal al-Din's forces waiting for them on the high ground. The battle that would shock the Mongol command was about to begin. The Parwan Valley is a natural killing ground if you're defending it properly. Narrow, bounded by steep slopes and rocky outcroppings, it funnels any attacking force into a confined space where numbers and mobility mean nothing. Based on the medieval accounts, Jalal al-Din had positioned his forces brilliantly. His infantry held the high ground at the valley's entrance, securing the passes and preventing any flanking movement. His cavalry, including the best Turkmen and Khwarezmian horsemen, were positioned to strike at the Mongols once they committed to the valley. The battle lasted 2 days, and the accounts we have, primarily from Persian and Arab historians writing shortly after the events, suggest it was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire Mongol Western campaign. On the first day, the Mongols probed the Khwarezmian defenses, testing for weak points. They advanced into the valley mouth, their horse archers loosing volleys at the defenders, but the terrain didn't allow them to spread out into their usual crescent formation. They couldn't surround the enemy. They couldn't use their mobility to find and exploit gaps in the defensive line. Instead, they found themselves channeled into a narrow front where the Khwarezmians could concentrate their forces. Jalal al-Din's men held their positions, absorbing the arrow volleys and waiting for the right moment to counterattack. When Mongol cavalry tried to push further into the valley, Khwarezmian horsemen charged down from the slopes, crashing into the Mongol flanks in the confined space. The bars. Terrain turned the Mongols' greatest strengths into liabilities. Horse archers need room to maneuver, to advance, shoot, retreat, and shoot again. In the narrow valley, packed close together, they couldn't employ these tactics effectively. When they tried to retreat to reorganize, the rocky, uneven ground slowed them, making them vulnerable to pursuit. Contemporary accounts describe chaos among the Mongol ranks, something virtually unheard of in Mongol warfare. Units became separated in the confined space. Communications broke down. The disciplined, coordinated attacks that had destroyed armies across Asia faltered against an enemy who refused to break and terrain that negated mobility. The first day ended inconclusively. The Mongols withdrew to regroup, having taken significant casualties, but still maintaining unit cohesion. From what we can piece together from the sources, Shigi Kutuku was already beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had entered terrain unsuited to Mongol tactics against an enemy who had specifically chosen this ground to negate Mongol advantages. On the second day, based on the medieval accounts, Shigi Kutuku tried a different approach. The Mongols were famous for their feigned retreats, a tactic that had destroyed countless enemy armies. They would attack, then appear to break and flee in panic. Enemy forces, sensing victory, would pursue in disorganized chaos. Then the Mongols would suddenly turn, reformed and coordinated, and annihilate the scattered pursuers. It had worked 1,000 times before. At Parwan, contemporary chroniclers tell us it failed catastrophically. When the Mongol cavalry appeared to break and retreat, Jalal al-Din, whether through tactical brilliance or simply knowing the Mongol playbook, didn't take the bait. Instead of sending his entire force in disordered pursuit, he carefully sent specific units forward while maintaining his defensive positions. When the Mongols turned to spring their trap, they found not a disordered mob, but organized Khwarezmian cavalry still under command control. What followed was brutal close-quarters fighting in the valley. The Mongols couldn't escape the confined space. Every route out was blocked or covered by Khwarezmian forces. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't employ their usual tactics, couldn't even effectively retreat. They were trapped in a narrow valley, taking casualties from all sides, and their vaunted discipline began to crack. The Persian historian Atta Malik Juvaini, writing a generation later, described the slaughter in the valley as immense. Mongol units were surrounded and annihilated. The rocky ground was slick with blood. Wounded horses and men blocked the narrow passages, making organized movement impossible. By the battle's end, Shigi Kutuk had lost a substantial portion of his army. Contemporary sources place Mongol casualties around 15,000 men, though, as with all medieval numbers, this should be treated with caution. What's clear from multiple accounts is that the defeat was severe enough that Shigi Kutuku fled the field with whatever forces he could extract from the valley, leaving behind not just dead but captured Mongols, standards, equipment, and any illusion of invincibility. The Khwarezmians, according to multiple sources, showed no mercy to captured Mongols. Medieval chroniclers report they were executed. Some accounts mention brutal methods like driving stakes into their ears as revenge for the massacres at Merv, Nishapur, and countless other cities. For the first time in the Western campaign, Mongol soldiers were the ones being massacred, the ones dying helplessly while their enemies took vengeance for 2 years of terror. When news of the victory spread, it electrified the conquered territories. In Merv, in Herat, in cities that had surrendered and accepted Mongol rule, people rose in rebellion. A leader named Kush Tegan Palawan seized control of Merv and led a successful uprising. Herat threw off its Mongol administrators. Even in regions far from Parwan, the message was clear. The Mongols could be beaten. For Jalal al-Din, this should have been his finest hour. He had done what no other commander had managed in 2 years of war. He had destroyed a Mongol army in open battle. He had proven that with the right terrain, the right tactics, and enough courage, the supposedly unstoppable conquerors could bleed and die like any other soldiers. But victory, as Jalal al-Din was about to discover, can be as dangerous as defeat. In the immediate aftermath of Parwan, Jalal al-Din's camp should have been celebrating. They'd achieved the impossible. They'd beaten the Mongols, saved their homeland, given hope to millions across Central Asia who had watched in horror as the Mongol tide swept everything before it. This was the moment where Jalal al-Din could consolidate his forces, capitalize on the rebellions breaking out in Mongol-occupied territories, and potentially turn a tactical victory into strategic revival for the Khwarezmian cause. Instead, according to the sources, everything fell apart over a horse. The medieval sources differ slightly on the exact details, but the broad strokes are consistent across multiple accounts. Among the spoils taken from the defeated Mongols was a particularly fine white horse, the kind of animal that was both a status symbol and genuinely valuable. An argument broke out over who should receive this horse. On one side was Saif al-Din Igrak, one of the Afghan chieftains who had brought thousands of warriors to Jalal al-Din's banner. On the other side was someone from Jalal al-Din's inner circle. The sources suggest possibly his father-in-law or another relative. What happened next was catastrophically stupid. Instead of handling the dispute carefully, recognizing that the fragile coalition of Afghan tribes, Turkmen warriors and Khwarezmian loyalists needed constant management to hold together, the sources indicate Jalal al-Din sided with his relative against the Afghan chief. Saif al-Din was insulted. His honor had been publicly questioned. And in the tribal culture of medieval Afghanistan, honor wasn't an abstract concept. It was life and death. It determined your status, your influence, your very identity. Within days, according to the chroniclers, Saif al-Din and his Afghan followers, some 30,000 men, packed up and left, just abandoned the army and went home. Other Afghan contingents followed. They hadn't come to fight for the Khwarezmian dynasty. Not really. They'd come to defend their homes against the Mongols. They'd done that, at least for now. And if the Khwarezmian prince couldn't even handle dividing spoils fairly, why should they risk their lives following him further? In a matter of days, possibly a week, Jalal al-Din's force of around 60,000 men shrank to perhaps 30,000. Half his army gone because of a dispute over one horse. And Genghis Khan was coming. When news of Parwan reached Genghis Khan, medieval chroniclers report he was furious, not just angry at the defeat, though that was bad enough, but humiliated that his adopted son had been beaten, that the myth of Mongol invincibility had been shattered. According to some accounts, when Genghis visited the battlefield later and spoke with Shigi Kutuku, he said something to the effect of, "You did not know the place of battle," faulting both Shigi Kutuk for fighting in such terrain, and perhaps himself for sending insufficient forces with an inexperienced field commander. Genghis Khan gathered his main army and marched south with one objective: destroy Jalal al-Din and restore the fear that made cities surrender without a fight. He brought seasoned combat commanders, he brought overwhelming force, and he was absolutely determined to make an example of the prince who had dared to humiliate the Mongol Empire. Jalal al-Din, now with a much smaller army and knowing that the full weight of Genghis Khan's wrath was descending on him, made the only decision he could. He couldn't fight the Khan in the field, not with his reduced numbers, and not with his remaining troops' morale shaken by the mass desertions. He had to get out of Afghanistan, find a place to regroup, rebuild his forces, and try again. He turned east toward India. The Indus River marked the border with the Sultanate of Delhi. If he could cross the river, he might find sanctuary, or at least enough breathing room to gather new forces. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. The march was a nightmare. Jalal al-Din had to move quickly, but his army was now burdened with refugees, civilians fleeing the Mongols, who had attached themselves to the only military force offering any protection. Women, children, elderly people, all slowing down the march, while the Mongol army closed in from behind. Genghis Khan, in contrast, traveled light and fast. He pushed his forces hard, knowing that if Jalal al-Din escaped into India, the war would drag on, rebellions would continue, and the message sent by Parwan would spread further. The Khan needed to crush Jalal al-Din decisively and publicly. On November 24, 1221, just 2 months after Parwan, the two armies met on the banks of the Indus River near modern-day Calabar, Pakistan. Jalal al-Din had about 30,000 troops. Genghis Khan's forces vastly outnumbered him. Sources vary, but it was probably at least a 2-to-1 advantage, possibly more. The battle at the Indus was everything Parwan wasn't. Open ground, room for the Mongols to maneuver, no terrain advantages for the defenders. Jalal al-Din positioned his forces with the river at their backs, one flank protected by steep ridges. It was the best defensive position available, but it wasn't enough. The battle began at dawn. The Khwarezmian left wing, positioned on the ridge, held firm despite repeated Mongol attacks. Genghis kept feeding fresh troops into the fight, wearing them down through sheer weight of numbers. On the other flank, commanded by Genghis's son Ogedei, the Mongols made initial progress, but Jalal al-Din personally led a counterattack that drove them back. For a few hours, it looked like Jalal al-Din might pull off another miracle. His personal courage was undeniable. Contemporary sources describe him charging repeatedly into the Mongol lines. But Genghis Khan was no Shigi Kutuku. He recognized the strength of the Khwarezmian position on the ridge and sent a detachment of elite troops under a commander named Bela Noyan to climb the steep slope and outflank them. It was a brutal climb. The Mongols took casualties making the ascent, but they got there. When they crested the ridge and attacked the Khwarezmian left from behind, the defensive line collapsed. Within minutes, one flank was in full retreat, then the other. The Khwarezmian center, surrounded on 3 sides with the river at their back, began to break. Jalal al-Din, seeing that the battle was lost, did something that became legendary in the Islamic world. Rather than surrender, rather than be captured and displayed in chains, he charged through the Mongol lines one last time, reached the riverbank, and according to the dramatic account preserved by multiple chroniclers in full armor, on horseback, leapt from a cliff into the Indus River. The sources describe the cliff as around 30 feet high, though the exact height is uncertain. The Indus was swollen from recent rains, deep and fast-flowing. Jumping into it in heavy armor should have been suicide. But the accounts tell us Jalal al-Din somehow stayed on his horse, and the horse somehow made it across the raging current to the far bank. He emerged on the other side, alone, dripping wet, having lost everything: his army, his family, his empire, but alive. Medieval sources record that Genghis Khan, watching from the opposite bank, saw this feat and allegedly said something like, "A father should be fortunate to have such a son," or words to that effect. The story goes that he then ordered his archers not to shoot at the fleeing prince. Whether this happened out of genuine respect for Jalal al-Din's courage, or simply because one man alone was no longer a military threat, the sources suggest the Khan let him go. The Khwarezmian army that stayed behind wasn't so fortunate. The Mongols slaughtered them. Those who tried to swim across the river were shot by archers standing on the bank. The refugees who had followed Jalal al-Din were killed. His entire family, including his young sons, were executed. Contemporary accounts suggest maybe 4,000 people made it across the Indus alive, out of an army and refugee column that had numbered in the tens of thousands. Jalal al-Din survived. He spent 3 years in India, trying to build alliances, raising new armies, refusing to give up. Eventually, he made his way back to Persia and tried to rebuild the Khwarezmian Empire from scratch. He won some victories, captured some territory, but it was never enough. The Mongols sent another army in 1231, and Jalal al-Din, now hunted and alone, was killed by a Kurdish assassin in the mountains near Diyarbakir in August 1231. He died at around 32 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life fighting the Mongols, winning impossible victories and suffering catastrophic defeats. He never surrendered, never stopped resisting, never accepted that the world the Mongols were building had no place for princes like him. The Battle of Parwan lives in an odd space in history. It's not widely known outside specialist circles, overshadowed by the Mongols' overwhelming victories and by the tragic aftermath at the Indus. But it matters, both for what it showed in the moment and for what it represented. In the immediate aftermath, Parwan's impact was real and significant. The rebellions that broke out in Merv, Herat, and other cities forced the Mongols to spend months suppressing revolts, delaying their westward expansion and costing them casualties they could ill afford to lose. These weren't major setbacks in the grand scheme of the Mongol conquests, but they were inconveniences, reminders that conquered populations hadn't fully accepted Mongol rule. More importantly, Parwan demonstrated something the Mongols' enemies desperately needed to know. The Mongols could be beaten, not through luck, not through some fluke of circumstances, but through intelligent use of terrain, through understanding the Mongol tactics and preparing counter-tactics, through courage and competent leadership. Jalal al-Din proved it could be done. The problem was that it required very specific circumstances. You needed terrain that negated Mongol mobility. You needed a commander who understood Mongol tactics well enough to counter them. You needed troops willing to stand their ground against the most feared army in the world. And you needed to avoid the kinds of internal disputes that tore Jalal al-Din's coalition apart after the victory. Most of the Mongols' enemies couldn't or wouldn't create those circumstances. It was easier to surrender, to hope the Mongols would be merciful to those who didn't resist, even though the evidence overwhelmingly suggested they wouldn't be. It was easier to flee, to save yourself and your immediate family, and hope the storm would pass. It was easier to avoid the fight entirely. Jalal al-Din chose differently. He fought because fighting was the only choice he could make and still be himself. And for 2 days in September 1221, in a mountain valley in Afghanistan, he proved that courage and intelligence could overcome even the most terrifying military machine the medieval world had ever produced. The historical record suggests the Mongols learned from Parwan. They became more cautious about fighting in mountainous terrain. They made sure to send experienced commanders with overwhelming force when terrain disadvantages were unavoidable. They adapted because adaptation was one of the Mongol Empire's greatest strengths. But for those 2 days, in that narrow valley, the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered, and for every person in Central Asia who heard about it, who learned that the seemingly unstoppable conquerors had been beaten, it mattered. It gave hope. It showed that resistance was possible. That hope didn't save the Khwarezmian Empire. It didn't stop the Mongol conquests. It didn't prevent the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people across Central Asia and beyond. But it existed, and for Jalal al-Din, who spent his entire adult life fighting an unwinnable war, who lost everything but never surrendered, that hope was enough. Today you can still visit the Parwan Valley. It's part of Parwan province in Afghanistan, about 50 miles north of Kabul. The terrain is still rugged, still mountainous, still the kind of place where cavalry would struggle to operate. There's no monument marking where the battle happened. Most people who live there probably don't know or don't think about the fact that 8 centuries ago, history briefly pivoted in their valley. But it did happen. Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, the last Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire, the prince who refused to surrender, won his greatest victory there. And for 2 days in September 1221, the Mongol tide was turned back. And one man proved that even empires built on terror and slaughter could be made to bleed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic last stands, hit that like button and subscribe to Tell Me Something for more stories of courage, tragedy, and the moments that changed the world. The Battle of Parwan is history you probably never learned in school, but it's history that matters. History that shows what humans are capable of when everything is on the line. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.